Here then is the skin node. Clearly a material-specific type of shader. Its primary use, unsurprisingly enough, is for skin-type materials. Now, this is a pretty straightforward shader, but a little tricky if you're not sure exactly what it's supposed to be doing. Although it is so called, it can function as well as a general-purpose subsurface scattering type of shader, allowing you to do waxy and other subsurfacey translucent effects and the like. And it does also have some nice features which help us work towards those sorts of materials with more control over the final look. So it's actually a pretty straightforward material. It is easy to get a bit lost in all these different weightings and trying to work it all together. But you'll see that once you get the basic idea, it's pretty easy to get on with. Basically, what this shader contains is multiple sets of the same setting. So we've got 2 sets for specular, and we've effectively got 3 diffuse values as well. And largely that's all that this material gives us. It gives us a specular value and a diffuse value. It just happens to give you multiples of each. Now, whilst it is PBR and all, it's not energy conserved. These things are additive. It's a whole bunch of additive values that you can mix together to get multi-layered effects. So to that extent, you do want to work in a certain amount of balance between the different weight values that we have. However, it is supposed to be an artistic material, so you don't have to, stick rigidly to making everything balance out exactly perfect. One of the handy things about the skin material is it does let us have that little bit of extra control so that we can just push things to get right into the look we want without having to fiddle too much with these more specific and granular controls of colour and distance. The specular does have a Fresnel built into it, as you can see on the 2 Fresnel settings that we have here. We'll see that in a minute. So that is done for you. There is no Fresnel in the actual weights for the dermis layers. So there's no diffuse reciprocity. If you want to add it, you can. Normally what I tend to do is rather than putting the Fresnel to the weight, I'll often tweak the distance with the inverse of it. But that said, it's not hugely that necessary because again, even though the material is all additive and you can thus go over the energy conservation of it all, it is still well managed so things look good when they layer up. So let's start out by just killing all of these diffuse or dermis weights and we'll check out just the specular. And what I'm going to do is set the sheen to 0 and we'll just look at the main specular weight to start with. So just like everywhere else, this is our good old specular reflection strength. And on skin it has a couple of simple settings. Obviously the strength of it, which is the weight, the roughness, of course, controls the glossiness of the reflection. But then we also get this other setting for Fresnel. Basically, this is much like an IOR setting. So if I come round here, let us say, then we can see that we're getting a Fresnel-like effect on the back of this ball fellow here. You'll see that as I take this up to 100%, then it becomes more metal-like. Rather, the Fresnel effect is weaker. And as we come down to 0, then we wind up with Fresnel exclusively on the rim, or specularity exclusively on the rim with full Fresnel. As such, this is kind of a Fresnel-ness controller that you have here. Makes it nice and easy to tweak the specular fall off on your skin like this. So what about the sheen? Well, the sheen is basically exactly the same again. It is just another specular. And it has exactly the same settings, weight and roughness and the Fresnel and how pronounced that effect. Basically, the usefulness of this is that you can get a multi-layered specular. Most commonly, what you will tend to do is have your sheen be your rougher reflection. So let's try something like 50% roughness. And of course you get this, I suppose, sheen, do you not? It's not the same, of course, as sheen in the principled material, which was a diffuse effect. This is a specular effect. So you can have this nice, soft component to the specular of your skin. And very often we might set this to be much tighter towards the grazing angle and, of course, weaker on the front face. So we give our sheen effect a good dose of the Fresnel there. Perhaps a little less rough. There we go. Of course, what we can also have is a specular layer on top of this. So we'll have a specular, which will also be rough, but not anywhere near as rough. 8%, perhaps a good few percent more, something like 16 perhaps. There we go, 22, which is still partially reflective. It's like the more glossy reflections that you get on skin. and we'll give this its own Fresnel response as well. And with both of these on, we are then able to get a much more complex specular shade to our surface. Of course, very often we do want to balance these out. At the moment, having them both at 100% does make them very strong. Generally, I tend to just balancing them at 100 for the two, so 50% each, or some mix thereof. Perhaps 40 for the glossy and 60 for the shine or the sheen. Lastly then, we also have the, specular and sheen colours, and you'll see that by default these are tinted to a very pale blue shade. It's quite a common thing to do, is to tint the specular of skin a little bit blue. In truth, it's like many dielectrics, it has, mostly a white highlight. But part of the thing with scattering, of course, is that the diffuse reflection isn't happening at the same point as the specular reflection. The light is scattering through. Because we often see in skin, this red scattered colour, that sort of can tend to give a bluish tint or a bluish look to the specular reflection by contrast. So the pale blue is probably going to be, good as default for the majority of surfaces. You usually won't want to take it very far away from white, no matter what colour you're trying to tint it. Now, skin does also do well, especially in the specular, from a bump, and it's especially helpful to see what you're doing once you start getting into the dermis weights, as of course being scattering, the scattering weakens the bump. You don't see it much, if at all, in the actual diffuse. So I'm going to do a common one for skin and use the old crumple texture here, plug that in, make it something like 20mm, invert it, and by default it's going to be very bumpy. Bring it down to something probably about 22%, and there you can see straight away how our specular and sheen are behaving on a surface like this. It already looks more leather-like, which of course is that sort of very similar sort of shine that you will see in skin. So with that looking good then, let's kill it off the minute whilst we come and look at our layers of diffuse in isolation here. We'll turn that first one up to 100. So what do we have? Well, we have a diffuse layer with subsurface scattering, and it basically just gives us a colour with a scattering depth. So if we have a look at these guys, then we'll see, for instance, the round ball fellow here. He's got a diameter of about 30 centimetres. His little nose thing is just a few millimetres across. So let's have a look at what we get. At present, we've got a weight of 100%. Let's just make him pure white for ease. And we see that we're getting a softish look, but we're not getting any shine through on the nose. So let's take this up something like 8mm, and consequently you can see how on our thin areas of geometry we're starting to get this shine through. Probably take it up some more, how about 18? And there we go, it's coming through much more strongly now. Of course, this isn't 18mm thick, not quite anywhere near it. Our distance is basically how far light can penetrate carrying this colour until they die. There will be a fall off in that as well. So you will find oftentimes when you're having very thin areas of skin, like the ears for instance, which may only be a couple of millimetres thick, when you want to get the shine through on things, you will tend to go for higher distances. Because of course, if you're trying to get shine through the ear and you put the distance in as 2mm, then that pretty much is the point at which the rays have stopped coming through. It's not a hard cut-off, remember, it's a soft cut-off. So even at something like 4mm, though it's greater than the thickness of the geometry, how much of the light is left after 4mm still isn't that much. So that's the first thing to note in our subsurface scattering here. Of course, we'll notice that it doesn't just do shine through like that, which is the forward scattering, it also does our soft front face, the back scattering, if we look at it here from the direction of the actual light itself. Then we can indeed see that we're getting this very soft, waxy look. So distance is also, when we're dealing with how things look from lighted sides, not shadow sides, distance is also basically your softness setting. The higher you set that, the more translucent your object appears to be. See that if we go up very deep here, like 72mm, then we get something very translucent indeed. You can also notice that areas where we're reaching that distance, where it's thinner, we're getting darkening. Of course, this is because light is passing through and not coming back to us. It's being scattered all the way through. We get this shadow of the transparency almost. We see, of course, that changing these scattering depths like this also changes the distribution of diffusion in the surface. And this area around the front here, which is falling into shadow a bit, it's all very much softened out. Whilst, of course, at low settings, it's much firmer in appearance. Now, what about the weight and the fact that we've got multiple weights? Well, let's have a look. We'll see how this scattering weight, or the dermis weight, works for us. So something that can be helpful with skin is to use another material, such as just a quick standard material, to gauge it against. In this case, I've just got a 100% diffuse and an all white material. So this gives me an idea of how much diffuse shading I expect to see. Obviously this is pure white, but a lot of it's looking grey just because it's not overly illuminated. But we've got just a couple of areas coming from the light itself where we are just starting to hit pure white and perhaps even overburn a little bit. The point is that we've got something to rate against. The thing with scattering, of course, is that it passes some light away from you, and also when light doesn't make it through, it's absorbed and it's never reflected back as diffuse. As such, subsurface scattering can make colours start to appear darker. Of course, if you think about it, in the real world, a person's face, their skin, will be absorbing some of the light that scatters into it. So the colour of the skin and their tone of their skin, the actual colour as it were, is actually brighter than what you see. What you see is what comes back as diffuse reflection or scattering. So if you paint a skin texture to have the same sort of colour, tone and brightness as you see when you look at a person, or you use photographs of an actual person to make a texture out of, then the diffuse that you've got there that you're working with is the colour after absorption has occurred. You stick it on a skin material, you add on absorption, and it winds up going darker. So for that reason, it's good to have a gauge against what you expect the normal brightness of your textures to be. So there's two ways of dealing with that really. You either, paint your textures with these different colours, or you adjust for that in the shading. And to be honest, it's probably better to just always paint your textures and pick your colours in the colours that you expect to get and see, and to tweak brightness as necessary to befit the shader within the shader. So if this then is our standard, 100% pure white, and that's how its diffuse looks, then we can see that the weight for this, the epidermis at 100% and pure white, is pretty close to that in terms of its shading. Perhaps a tiny bit darker, especially of course where we see light will have hit it such from an angle that it is getting absorbed and some of it's scattered back. But we see that what we can do is we can violate the energy conservation essentially, and push the epidermis weight, push the diffuse value here higher than 100%, and now that's starting to give us the burn off into white back on those areas like that. So we can see that we're not, strictly bound. This does have artistic freedom to let you just nudge things to get the balance right. So speaking of which, let's see what happens with the other layers then. Now the idea with these is that you've again just got multiples of the same basic effect, just like we have with the specular. Having two layers of specular lets us get a more complex specular look, and the same is true with the scattering and diffuse. So let's take them all to white and put them up to 100%, and you can see, of course, that what we've got is something that's completely overblown and over bright. So these are just additive. When we've got three of them all at 100%, it's like having 300% diffuse. Now you can balance these, of course, off against one another to get different areas of your tone, of your colours shining through. That's one of the ways to control them, and we'll look at their control in a moment. Anytime you're starting off, it's probably just as well to set them all to 33% or 33.33% or whatnot, and that gives something around the expected level of diffuse. Sometimes with skin, I don't know, you sometimes do want to push that a little bit. You might go a little bit over, say 36, 36, 36. Now, because of the way that these three colours mix, it can be easy to get a bit messed up with your different surface colours or surface maps. Mixed into this, of course, is the different distances that you can have for each one. For instance, and going from the naming, you expect these to be the shallow, deep and deepest levels of the skin, right? we expect something pale-ish here, something roughly skin-coloured there, and of course the good old red for shine through. Of course, you don't have to use it in such a way. You can use just the 1 or 2 layers if you prefer. We already saw the 1, and of course you just get the shine through of that colour. But if you're just trying to get a top colour, shine through colour, you can do that easily by, of course, not using any third weight and just having perhaps your skin colour map and your, bloody deep skin colour map. Thus you have your target skin colour, you have your target blood layer colour, you give the main a little bit of distance to adjust for frontal softness appearance, you give the deep some greater depth setting so you can get the shine through, and there you go, you wind up with something roughly like this. We find, of course, that it tends to look a little on the dark side. We might want to go over, so no harm in turning the combined 2 up past 100. And you see here on the front we're getting something warmer, because we're getting a mix of the 2 colours, whilst on the shine through we're only getting the deeper dermis colour. And so here's a way in which I like to handle it. I'll show you this through the standard material here. I select a single colour. This is sort of the colour or shade that I'm approximately looking for the skin, or of course, more commonly this would be our image map, right? I multiply it twice. In one, of course, I'm going to want to be the underlayer. I make it very red. Simply keep the red multiplication high, keep the green and the blue low down. I do the exact opposite for the other multiplier, so the red down and the green and the blue up. Since this will probably be an image, but even if it's a single colour, I take a colour tool and desaturate the greener one, bring up its brightness and decrease its contrast a bit. And for the red layer, again, do the opposite, so up its saturation, decrease its brightness and increase its contrast, giving me those 2 there, which I then feed to the epidermis and the hypodermis colour, with my original colour going to the mid-level dermis colour. So we see, of course, the base colour that we're going for and the one that we get from making that mix there. Although this looks pretty good and, pretty good skin colour as well, it is different from just the base colour. Thus, the easiest thing to do is just to come in and tweak up a bit. The colour we put in was quite pale. I do want to, emphasise that one more, and that's going to our dermis. So, if I bring that up to 50 and I keep the others at 35, then I am starting to come out a little bit paler. I can perhaps go 60, 30, 30. And there we go. The colour's still slightly pinker because of course it's picking up that hint from the subsurface, but it looks pretty good. And the shine through that we see there looks pretty nice. We might just increase that distance a little bit for this, just set these slightly softer as well. So there we go. If we now turn our specular layers back on, we can get to see our skin as it should be, properly and fully formed here. Now we can see that starting to look pretty good. Maybe now I see it in place with the colour. I think I'm just a little bit shiny with my specular there. I might also just ease off on its Fresnel a little. There we are, just tone off that frontal reflection a little there. Now that seems to be making a pretty convincing looking skin there with good colour, good specular. There we go, does good to see it from the front, of course, from the actual direction of the light, where you're just getting that frontal softness. You don't have the benefit of the shine through to tell you that this is subsurface or that this is skin. You see that that's a nice convincing look there. And we take a look over here from the shadow side as well, so that we can see the specular coming off the Fresnel angle there, and we can see the shine through of some of these thin parts. And that's all playing nicely and working well, giving us a very nice look. And as we get in tight for a close-up look, then we can really see the detail of the bump map, which is subtle, starting to do its stuff. And what we're getting is something that works really well in backlighting as well here. So although we've been through these settings and we've seen that we can tweak them off a bit past what should be the energy conserving point for artistic goodness, we do try not to stray too far. And because of that, and owing to the way that this shader works and how all these things just add up, skin becomes one of those things that's really good to test under different lighting conditions. This good old harsh side lighting is of course a popular one because it does allow you to spin round and judge see-through and shine through on materials like this. But I prefer to do this as a starting step to, just get a basic handle of those base parameters so I can be sure that I'm getting something that will work with other objects in a scene textured using other shaders and materials. Making sure that what I would consider the overall diffuse 100 of this is a good match for the diffuse 100 of anything else, so as everything will line up nicely. What I want to do to check it, or just fine tune it, is to try it in different lighting environments though. It's always a good thing to do with skin, so that you can make sure it will definitely play nice from place to place. So I'm going to drop an HDRI in here. I'm going to make sure at this point that my guy is only using ray trace as the custom ought to be with objects. I'm going to turn off one of my lights and I'm going to make the other into an environment. And so here we go. This is now lit from this HDR, which has got quite a strong sun in it. And here on the shadow side we look pretty good. We can see a bit of shine through on that funny nose, only a little because of course we do still have strong environmental illumination catching the frontal shade, but there is a pinking, and from the side here that's actually catching the full light, then it looks pretty good and pretty bright. Specular looks good, and there we go up close. You can see it looks to be working out pretty well in this lighting situation. Of course, compatible with the amount of brightness and lighting that you see present in the background, all consistent, and it looks pretty good, and I think that we can quite honestly be pleased with what we've got here. And so what we see as well is that this sort of a way of working with the skin node can help us out working more swiftly with it in general, because usually this pattern of weighting is going to be broadly replicated in most skin types. So if we take the time to set up a base skin shader that respects, just the right sort of balance in its diffuse specular to look good in scenes with other items and work across consistent lighting situation, then we can do things such as just changing the color here, then we can get other shades and colors of skin that work in broadly the same pattern quite easily. One of the interesting things you'll see on white skin as well is that to an extent you can be more off with your parameters. It can be easier to fake. If you get it, sort of looking pale on the front and pinkish on the shine through, like a good piece of roast beef, then, it looks convincing. You're sort of given to think of it as skin already. But dark skin has different properties. The darker pigment absorbs more of the light, so you get less shine through. Also, red is a colour heavily absorbed, and so there's less of that to appear on the shine through as well. Generally, if you want to use darker colours in your skin, then the easiest way is often to come down with your scattering distance, and also very often your weights. So you can tend to go quite strong on the dermis weight and a little less on the others. Little tweaks like that and you can very easily get much darker skin tones as well. Behave really quite nicely, and of course makes the shader quite versatile indeed in that way. So there we go, that is the skin material, all of its settings and workings and the ways that we can play them with one another to create nice and realistic and subtle skin shading on our characters. It's an easy shader sometimes to, get a bit into a muddle with because it's got all of these many settings. But once you approach them in this nice, ordered way, you'll see that getting good results is quite easy and straightforward with it. So it's a great shader. We can get very good results with very little work indeed, and so I find that makes this a great material for uses that its name does suggest.